Welcome to this in-depth look at the line of sight rules for Nova Aetas Renaissance. For those of you who don't already know, Nova is a campaign-style board game on Kickstarter with lots of cool features such as miniatures, 3D terrain, maps, cities, crafting, combat, adventuring, a campaign book, secret envelopes, and much more, all in a setting which blends together Renaissance Italy with fantasy elements such as mythical creatures and magic. There's a link to the Kickstarter in the description, but this video is intended for those who are eventually going to play the game. The line of sight rules we're going to look at can apply to a variety of situations, such as ranged attacks and spellcasting. Gaining a solid mastery of these rules should make for a more enjoyable gameplay experience. Now, we're going to look at the four main rules which govern line of sight. Although the rules themselves are pretty straightforward, I'm going to really delve into the implications, so things might get a bit convoluted. If you've never played the game, then please don't come away from this video thinking that the whole game is complex and confusing, because it's not. Most of the rules are actually pretty simple. Let's begin with the first rule, which I'm going to rather unimaginatively call the line rule. This is the most important rule, and it applies to every situation. The other three rules are just for handling specific situations, such as standing on rooftops or hiding behind things. The rule is this. Line of sight is determined by drawing an imaginary line from the centre of any one side of the square occupied by the active model to the centre of the square occupied by the target model. So there are always four potential lines of sight. If any one of those lines is unobstructed, then the attacker has line of sight. Thematically, you can imagine that an attacker has the freedom to take a short step within their space and choose which of these 4 points to attack from. Obstructions which block line of sight include buildings, trees, opponents, and map edges. Models which don't block line of sight include bushes, allies, and figures which have been knocked out. Now, in practice, you won't typically need to consider all four imaginary lines. It's usually pretty obvious which lines to consider. For example, here we have a hero attempting to perform a ranged attack on a target, in this case an enemy. There's also another enemy figure between the two. Opponents do block line of sight, but in this case there's still an unobstructed line of sight, like this. So the hero can attack the target, provided it's in range of course. In this example, the hero becomes the target of an attack. It's being attacked by the enemy E1. In between are both a tree and another enemy, E2. Do we have line of sight? Well, trees do block line of sight, but remember that the two enemies are allies to each other, so they never break each other's line of sight. So we do have line of sight, and the hero can look forward to a guts full of crossbow bolt. If the attacker and the target are in the same row or column on the grid, then all possible lines of sight run through all the squares in between the figures, and it may be simplest to just imagine a single line running straight down the middle. The line rule in Nova Aetas is a little different from the line of sight rules I've encountered in other games, and initially struck me as unusual. But as it says in the rulebook, the rules for line of sight have been created to make the fight even more exciting. They are in fact able to simulate shots from behind cover, provided by some scenic elements. And they're not wrong. It's actually pretty cool. As you've probably noticed, if two figures are in different rows and columns, then their lines of sight to one another will be asymmetrical. In other words, just because figure A can see figure B doesn't necessarily mean that B can see A. Here are some examples, starting with a building. If both figures are at the corner of a building, then obviously they can see each other. Now let's move one of the figures away from the corner. In this case, figure A can see figure B, but B's best line of sight to A hits the corner of the building. As figure B moves further away, the result is much the same. Figure A can still see figure B, but not the other way round. Now let's move figure B away from the building and see what happens. Here we get the same result. A can see B, but B can't see A. In fact, all the squares highlighted in yellow produce the same result. If we imagine the board were much larger and we zoom out, we can visualize a boundary line which figure B would need to cross to gain an unobstructed view of figure A. And all this seems quite thematic too. Figure A can peek around the corner of the building to target figure B, who is exposed, and figure B would need to move to a better angle from that corner to get an unobstructed view. Already, the strategy of attacking from cover has emerged from a single rule, the line rule. But as rules go, the imbalance between the two figures seems quite extreme. It's a bit unfair or unrealistic to rule that figure A could target figure B perfectly, while B can't target A at all. And this is where the second line of sight rule comes in, the cover rule. Despite its name, this rule doesn't help figures to attack from cover. On the contrary, it reduces the effectiveness of being in cover. I should probably have called it the uncover rule, because it makes it possible to target figures even when they're behind cover. The rule states, if the line of sight only passes through a scenery element that is directly adjacent to the square occupied by the target, that target is considered to be in cover and may be attacked, though with reduced accuracy. In other words, line of sight is not blocked if the only scenic element traversed is adjacent to the target. In our example, suppose figure A wants to target figure B. Since there's already an unobstructed line of sight, the cover rule is of no relevance and can be ignored. So figure A can attack without limitation. Now consider figure B attempting to target figure A. This is where the cover rule kicks in. Even though there isn't a clear line of sight, the cover rule enables figure A to be targeted anyway. We just need to confirm a few things. That the best line of sight only passes through a single obstruction, which it does, that the obstruction is adjacent to the target, which it is, and that the obstruction is a building or a tree, which it is. And finally, remember that the resulting attack will have reduced accuracy. As you might have guessed, reducing accuracy means re-rolling a die to make the attack less effective. The details depend on whether the target is a hero or an enemy, so check out the rulebook for more information. I think that in some situations, like this one, the cover rule does a reasonable job of addressing the problem it's trying to solve, namely that figures in cover shouldn't become invisible or unassailable. But in other situations, the rule doesn't work so well, and I would go so far as to humbly offer up an alternative rule which I think is just as easy to manage, but produces more natural results. But before I suggest this house rule, let's take a closer look at the shortcomings of the official cover rule. Consider what happens if figure A steps away from the corner of the building. You would reasonably expect that they would become a little bit more exposed and maybe more vulnerable to attack. But instead, figure A suddenly becomes invisible to figure B. Figure B has no line of sight to its target, and the cover rule doesn't apply because figure A is no longer adjacent to the obstruction. So we have a counterintuitive result. Here's another situation where the official cover rule fails. Imagine two combatants, each with projectile weapons in an open field. One of them is hiding behind a tree and the other one is out in the open. Who would you expect to have the advantage in this situation? Thematically, you would expect the tree to offer some protection to the person behind it and the exposed figure to be more vulnerable. However, when we set up the board like this, we get the exact opposite result. The hero, behind the tree, can't target her opponent at all because there's no line of sight, and the cover rule doesn't apply because the target isn't adjacent to any obstacle. Now consider what happens when the enemy attempts to attack the hero. Line of sight is once again blocked by the tree, but since there's only one obstacle and it's adjacent to the target, the cover rule applies and the hero can be attacked, albeit with reduced accuracy. So in this position, the tree puts the hero at a huge disadvantage, which seems very counterintuitive. There are other shortcomings too, but I don't want to get bogged down in the details. I think all of these issues can be avoided by abandoning the official cover rule and replacing it with a house rule, that a figure is in cover whenever it can see its opponent without being seen. Pretty simple really. Apart from that, cover works as already described. In other words, accuracy is reduced whenever you attempt to attack a target which is in cover. So in our previous example, the tree will block line of sight for both figures, provided they're all in a line. And if only one figure can see the other, then that figure is in cover. It can be attacked, but with reduced accuracy. With this proposed rule, you no longer need to worry about how many obstacles are traversed by the line of sight, or who's adjacent to what. It would also mean that if you're behind a phalanx of allies, you could still be targeted by an enemy, though with reduced accuracy. This seems quite thematic too. There are too many other possible examples to cover here, so let's move on, and you can decide for yourself which cover rule works best for you. I like to think the game designers are open-minded about house rules because they mention them at the start of the rulebook. The final two line of sight rules are pretty quick and easy to cover. If you're attacking from a rooftop, then line of sight is blocked by any rooftop edge you're not adjacent to. So from the corner of a rooftop you can see over 2 edges, and from the middle you can only see over 1 edge. Refer to the rulebook for other rooftop rules, such as increased range for physical attacks, and the ability to see over the top of anything which isn't massively tall, like a tree or a building. And the final rule is specifically for bushes. Bushes don't block line of sight, but if a figure is behind one, then they're considered to be in cover. I'll finish by pointing out that this video is based on my own interpretations of the Alpha rulebook, which was available during the Kickstarter campaign. So keep in mind that the rules are subject to change and occasionally open to interpretation. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching, and I hope that this video has given you some ideas for getting the most out of your game.